September 1824. Mexican troops surround villages. 40% of voters scream fraud, and an entire region refuses to accept the result. Chiapas was meant to belong to Guatemala. 212 years of history pointed in that direction. But a suspicious referendum, soldiers on the streets, and empty promises changed the map of Central America forever. Today, Chiapas is the poorest state in Mexico, while Guatemala still bleeds from the loss. And in 2025, a judicial decision over another territory may reopen wounds that never healed. The question is not whether there was theft, it is why no one talks about it. Imagine a suffocating room in September 1824, where sweating men hold pieces of paper that will decide the fate of millions. Chiapas was about to choose its future, and what happened in that vote still echoes through the mountains today. Mexican troops surrounded villages, whispers of intimidation spread through the markets. And entire families were torn between historical loyalty and promises of prosperity. The official result claimed that Chiapas chose Mexico, but the numbers told a different story. 40% of voters completely rejected the annexation to Mexico, an enormous number that history books prefer to whisper instead of shout. It was not an overwhelming victory. It was a questionable conquest disguised as democracy. Entire communities in the Soconusco region simply refused to accept the result, declared neutrality, and turned their backs on Mexico City. Think about it. Nearly half of a population saying no to the country that was supposed to become their new homeland. But why does this border conflict matter so much today, almost 200 years later? Because Chiapas still carries the scars of that forced choice. It is the poorest state in Mexico, a rich land turned into a forgotten territory. The truth behind that referendum reveals much more than a simple border dispute. It shows how nations are built on cracked foundations, and how historical claims can haunt entire generations, especially when the story begins long before 1824. Between 1609 and 1821. The Captaincy General of Guatemala was a true powerhouse that would make any modern nation jealous. Forget today's maps. This Spanish colonial empire controlled everything from southern Mexico to Costa Rica. A stretch of land that would cover the equivalent of 5 modern countries. Chiapas was not a random piece on the board. It was an integral part of that giant for an impressive 212 years. Imagine if São Paulo controlled half of Brazil, and you will get an idea of the scale of that union. The connection between Chiapas and Guatemala was not just administrative, it was deeply visceral. Ancient trade routes crossed the Sierra Madre Mountains, carrying coffee, cocoa, and textiles between cities that shared the same Mayan cultural identity. Families ran businesses on both sides. Children grew up speaking the same indigenous languages, and Guatemala City was the gravitational center of everything. The Soconusco region, that rich strip of land between the mountains and the Pacific, acted as the crown jewel, producing wealth that fueled the entire region. When Spain started losing control of its colonies in the early 19th century, no one in Chiapas imagined that this lost territory would become Mexican. The cultural identity was so intertwined with Guatemala that separating the two regions would be like ripping roots from a 200-year-old tree. But empires fall, borders shake, and sometimes, ambitious neighbors see opportunity where there should have been bonds of brotherhood. Historical documents reveal what Mexican schoolbooks prefer to omit. That 1824 referendum was as clean as an election inside a police state. Troops under General Santa Anna, yes, the same one who would later lose Texas, had already occupied strategic positions in Chiapas weeks before the vote. Entire Maya communities, which made up the majority of the population, were conveniently left out of the electoral process. Coincidence? Guatemalan historians call it an orchestrated annexation referendum, not a democratic choice. Mexico offered golden promises: local autonomy, infrastructure investments, political representation in the new National Congress. Meanwhile, Guatemala, newly independent and staggering after the collapse of the Spanish Empire, could barely offer stability to itself. Santa Anna played the perfect game, arrived as a liberator, promised prosperity, and placed enough soldiers on the streets to maintain order. When the votes were counted, Chiapas had supposedly chosen Mexico, yet 40% of the population cried fraud. Soconusco simply said no. That rebellious region, used to commercial autonomy and deeply connected to Guatemalan ports, refused to raise the Mexican flag. They declared political neutrality, a bold move that infuriated Mexico City and made Guatemala secretly dream of a reversal. This territorial dispute was only beginning, and the next 18 years would prove that forced votes never erase memories. Soconusco became the living symbol of resistance, a strip of land trapped between the Sierra Madre Mountains and the Pacific Ocean that refused to bend its knees. From 1824 to 1842, the region operated as neutral territory, raising its own flag and maintaining commercial relations with whoever wanted to trade. Coffee farmers continued selling through Guatemalan ports. Local authorities ignored decrees coming from Mexico City, and the Maya population kept their traditions as if nothing had changed. It was a mini-nation inside a much larger conflict. Geography made that stubbornness almost inevitable. Crossing the mountains toward central Mexico took weeks of dangerous travel, while heading down to the Pacific ports controlled by Guatemala took only a few days. Centuries-old trade routes made far more sense than new political promises. Santa Anna watched all of this with growing anger. He had secured the vote in Chiapas, but Soconusco was a thorn stuck in Mexico's legitimacy. How do you convince the world that you won a referendum if an entire region ignores the result? In 1842, Mexico's patience ran out. Santa Anna sent military troops to restore order, a polite euphemism for an undeclared invasion. There was no second referendum, no diplomatic negotiation, only soldiers crossing the border and planting Mexican flags in towns that resisted fiercely. Guatemala filed formal protests, sent furious letters, threatened international measures, but it was too weak to do anything except watch. And that marked the beginning of an occupation that would last for decades without official recognition, until a treaty signed under pressure sealed the fate of this border conflict forever. When Guatemala finally sat at the negotiating table in 1882, it was not by choice, it was because it had no cards left to play. The Central American Federation had collapsed into pieces, leaving Guatemala isolated and more vulnerable than ever. Internal revolts drained the country. The army could barely control the capital and Mexico. Well, Mexico had 40 years of military occupation in Soconusco as its final argument. Negotiating from a position of weakness is like signing your own defeat with permanent ink. Mexico entered that meeting declaring Chiapas and Soconusco as non-negotiable territories, a diplomatic way of saying they were already ours. Accept it or face the consequences. Compare it with other unfair treaties in history and you will see the same pattern. The stronger nation dictates the terms. The weaker nation swallows its pride. Guatemalan diplomats tried to argue about the 212 years of historical unity, about the deep Mayan cultural ties, about that questionable referendum from 1824. Every argument hit the solid wall of Mexico's military reality. To this day, Guatemalans call that lost territory La Mexicana, not with explicit anger, but with the silent pain of someone who lost a piece of national identity. The 1882 treaty did not solve anything emotionally. It only legalized a conquest that had already been completed. Chiapas became officially Mexican on paper, but did it ever become Mexican in the heart? Today's economic numbers whisper a disturbing answer about what happens when territories are annexed by force and then simply forgotten. Chiapas holds a record that no state wants. 75.5% of its population lives in multidimensional poverty, the worst rate in all of Mexico. Its per capita income is 60% below the national average, And even though it is the 10th largest state in territory, it ranks only 15th in population. These numbers are not just cold statistics. They are economic scars from an annexation that promised prosperity and delivered abandonment. Is it a coincidence that the most contested territory became the most neglected? Think about the cruel irony. Chiapas carries Mayan roots that date back to 1500 before Christ. It has breathtaking natural resources, fertile lands that produce world-class coffee. Culturally, it is a treasure. Economically, it is treated like dead weight. Compare it to the states in central Mexico, the ones whose loyalty was never questioned, and the difference in federal investment screams through the data. It is as if Mexico City never fully forgave those 40% who voted against the annexation in 1824. The question Guatemalans quietly ask, and Mexicans avoid answering, is simple. Would Chiapas be better off if it had remained Guatemalan? Obviously, Guatemala also faces serious economic issues, but at least Chiapas would not carry the stigma of being the forgotten child of a larger nation. That invisible Guatemala Mexico border, the one that exists in people's hearts and not on maps, continues to bleed silently. And while Chiapas withers, another territorial dispute in the region is about to erupt in a way that might force everyone to confront those unresolved historical claims. While the world turned the page on Chiapas, Guatemala never forgot the bitter taste of losing that territory. Today, the country claims no less than 53% of Belize. Yes, more than half of an independent nation. Based on historical claims that sound dangerously familiar. The International Court of Justice is reviewing the case right now. And a ruling in Guatemala's favor could open Pandora's box of Central American territorial disputes. Guatemalan lawyers are already sharpening their arguments about unjustly lost territories. If Guatemala manages to prove before the court that Belize should be theirs by historical rights, the legal precedent would be explosive. Imagine the argument. If we can get Belize back after decades, why can't we question Chiapas as well? Mexico knows this and watches every step of the judicial process with nervous caution. A Guatemalan victory in 2025 would not redraw the map overnight, but it would reignite the flames of a territorial dispute that took an entire century to be partially forgotten. The world has seen this movie before. South Sudan separated in 2011. Bougainville voted for independence from Papua New Guinea in 2019. Borders that once seemed carved in stone begin to crack when local populations feel they never truly belonged. Chiapas has its own history of rebellion. The Zapatista movement of 1994 proved that Mayan identity remains stronger than national flags. But are we really heading toward a new referendum? Or are there geographic reasons that make separation virtually impossible, no matter how loudly history screams for justice? The first natural barrier should have been impossible to cross. The Sierra Madre de Chiapas creates a mountainous wall between Chiapas and the rest of Mexico that would make any modern engineer break into a sweat. Crossing those mountains in 1824 took weeks of brutal travel, while heading toward Guatemala took only days along already established roads. It is as if Rio de Janeiro were geographically closer to Buenos Aires than to Brasilia. Nature was screaming which direction Chiapas naturally belonged to, but politics completely ignored it. Trade routes told another story that was inconvenient for the Mexican narrative. Soconusco had direct access to the Pacific Ocean through ports that had operated in sync with Guatemala's economy for centuries. Coffee, cocoa, textiles, everything flowed naturally south, not north. Breaking those economic arteries to force integration with central Mexico was like trying to reverse the flow of a river. Technically possible, but brutally unnatural and expensive. The border conflict ignored centuries of commercial logic in the name of political ambition. But the deepest reason was invisible on maps: Mayan cultural identity. The people of Chiapas shared languages, traditions, and a worldview far more aligned with Guatemalans than with Mexicans from the Central Plateau. Even today, Mayan communities on both sides of that Guatemala Mexico border maintain connections that governments have never been able to erase. Geography is not just mountains and rivers, it is where people feel they belong. And if we could go back in time and redo that vote without troops intimidating voters, would the map of Central America look completely different today? Economically, Guatemala would be 25% larger in territory and gain something it never had before: direct access to the Gulf of Mexico through Tabasco. Imagine the possibilities: ports on both oceans, trade routes cutting across Central America from coast to coast, a strategic geographic position that could rival the Panama Canal in regional importance. Chiapas would bring fertile land, natural resources, and a hardworking population to a Guatemala that might have developed in a radically different way. But would that really have generated prosperity, or would it simply have changed who carries the burden of poverty? Politically, the balance of power in Central America would be unrecognizable. A larger Guatemala would have the diplomatic strength to negotiate on equal terms with Mexico, perhaps even leading a new attempt to reunify the failed Central American Federation. The territorial dispute with Belize likely would not exist. With Chiapas in its domain, Guatemala would have no reason to look east in search of lost territory. Mexico, on the other hand, would lose its land bridge to the south and become geographically isolated from Central America, reshaping the entire geopolitical dynamic of the 20th century. Culturally, this is where it becomes even more fascinating. Would the Zapatista movement of 1994 have happened? That Maya rebellion was born from a feeling of abandonment within Mexico. But what if Chiapas were part of a Guatemala where Maya identity was not a forgotten minority, but the cultural majority? Perhaps history would not remember Subcommandant Marcos, but instead, new leaders emerging from within a more representative government defending indigenous rights. History is not destiny, yet it builds the present we live in. And sometimes it is worth imagining the worlds that could have existed if a questionable annexation referendum had not changed everything on that afternoon in 1824. Chiapas was never taken by accident. It was a calculated conquest disguised as democracy. That 1824 referendum proved that borders are not drawn by the will of the people, but by the power of those who have more soldiers and better lawyers. And the final irony: the region Mexico fought so hard to conquer became the one it neglects the most. Maybe the real question is not, did Mexico steal Chiapas, but does anyone truly care about Chiapas? Because territories taken by force are rarely loved for real. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep learning about territorial disputes that shaped Latin America and that history books prefer to hide.